I'm Dr. Joseph Knippenberg, Professor of Politics here at Oglethorpe. And this is the 5th of 7 Great Books and Good Books lectures, sponsored by the Charles Koch Foundation and the Oglethorpe University Core Committee. Today's lecturer is Dr. William Bradford Smith, who has been at Oglethorpe since 1992 at least. He was here earlier in a part-time capacity.
No, 92 is when
Oh, 92 when he started? Okay. If he weren't our Reformation man, I'd say that Dr. Smith is our Renaissance man. He is a prolific scholar. There are 2 books in print and 1 on the way, at least, and he lists on this brief vita 15 articles. I'm sure there's at least twice that many somewhere. Among the languages that he claims at least some fluency in are German, Latin, French, Swedish, Old Norse, Italian, Czech, and I assume that's ancient Greek, not modern Greek. He also has musical conservatory training in piano and oboe. He acts. He's taught in at least 4 different core classes. Probably could do a few more if we pressed him, but I don't want to give anyone any ideas. He's an assiduous scholar, an exciting teacher, and a valued colleague. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brad Smith.
Thank you. You know, when I was putting this thing together, Joe asked me to come up with a title, and so I wrote my title. And I didn't really think much about it. You know, you do that. You write titles and you stick it somewhere. And then I looked at the title in print, and it occurred to me that some people might be confused as to my topic.
I was.
The title refers to a major image in my main point today, which is Yevgeny Zamyatin's dystopian science fiction novel, Me. The green wall features, as we will see, prominently, but it occurred to me that some people might be here under false pretenses. So right up front, I want to apologize to anyone who came here hoping to learn something about Duffy Lewis, Carlton Fisk, or Marilyn Chambers. The second thing I was going to say is this talk in some ways is a result of me doing something that I've never done before. Now, as Dr. Knippenberg has pointed out, I've taught Human Nature 1 and Human Nature 2, Historical Perspectives 1 and Historical Perspectives 2. I've never taught Historical Perspectives 2 and Human Nature 2 simultaneously. I've taught them at different times, but I've never taught the 2 of them together. And so this talk really arises out of a contemplation of works between those 2 courses. So this is a kind of mashup, if you will. Utopias and dystopias. This is a topic I've been dealing with directly or obliquely for some time. Of course, as a scholar of the Renaissance and Reformation, one of the early books we always studied was Utopia by Sir Thomas More. Of course, what most people don't realize is what utopia means, which is no place. The thing is that in most studies of utopias, the dark side of it are the dystopias. In a sense, I think More had it right at the beginning. In the description of an ideal and perfect society, no place is probably the correct name for such a location. I always find it entertaining that one of the later people who dealt with this was Voltaire, in this description of El Dorado and Candide, which they leave because it's boring. More often than not, utopias, whatever societies that are constructed along utopian lines, have turned out to be dystopian. Now, my own experience is kind of unusual in this regard. I'm a product of a utopia. My mother grew up in the town of Zion, Illinois, which is right near the Illinois-Wisconsin border. Zion was established as a religious utopia. It's a Christian socialist community of a millenarian bent. One of the things that's striking about it, and as I read Zamyatin, I was reminded of this, is that Zion is rigorously logical in its orientation. All of the north-south streets are named after figures in the Bible alphabetically, with A at Lake Michigan and moving across. My mother grew up on Gideon Avenue. The east-west streets are numbered. So the state line between Illinois and Wisconsin is 1st Street, and the southernmost street in town, as you might guess, is 33rd Street. The original founder of it, John Alexander Dowie, was a Scottish Presbyterian minister who came to believe that he was Elijah, and he founded the community in anticipation of the second coming of Christ. His successor, Wilbur Glenn Voliva, had a slightly different bent. And Voliva, in fact, became very much entranced in the 1920s with Mussolini, even to the point of establishing a rank of guards, of young people who wore special uniforms. The thing about Zion was everything was owned by the church. All of the industries, all of the businesses, one worked for the church. Every aspect of one's life was to be orchestrated according to the church, to the point that at one point Voliva criticized men in the community who were not involved somehow in church affairs. And he gave a famous sermon in which he called out what he called the do-nothing deacons and said unless they found something to do before the next Sunday, that the do-nothing deacons would have to wear special robes and sit in the front row in front of the building. One of my grandfather's business associates was among the list that was named, and so he joined the choir even though he could not carry a tune in a bucket. At one point, the fascination with Mussolini had gotten so far that Voliva actually suggested the entire community pack up and move to Mexico. This was in the late 1920s. And my grandfather said they probably would have gone. It was much later, at the time of the Jim Jones fiasco, that I remember my grandfather talking about that experience and saying how close they came and how easy it would have been to have fallen into that. The thing about it is, when we look at a place like Zion, or other kind of utopian communities, there is always a gulf between promise and reality. Above all, I think what stands out in most of these is the cost of salvation, the cost of happiness that is held forward. And very often in these communities, the promise of a better life, the promise of a perfect world, comes at the cost of individual liberty. And so there is my concern today. In 1934, a German doctor reported having the following dream, and I quote, "It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. My consultations were over and I was stretching out on the couch to relax with a book on Matthias Grunewald, when suddenly the walls of my room and then my apartment disappeared. I looked around and discovered to my horror that as far as the eye could see, no apartment had any walls anymore. Then I heard a loudspeaker boom, 'According to the decree of the 17th of this month on the abolition of walls.' This dreamscape, or more properly nightmarescape, corresponds very closely to the future ideal described by the protagonist of Yevgeny Zamyatin's dystopian novel, We. As the protagonist says, 'At all times we live behind our transparent walls that seem woven of gleaming air. We are always visible, always washed in light. In this visible world where no one has anything to conceal from the ever-vigilant guardians, our protagonist, number D503, lives out his orderly life. He rises, like every other number, precisely at 7 o'clock, as prescribed in the table of hours. He takes his breakfast at the common mess, chewing each bite of the petroleum byproduct food 50 times, according to the beat of the metronome. He works for some hours, at others he takes his exercise, marching in ranks 4 deep to the trumpeting sounds of the music factory. He attends lectures at the proper hour when he learns of the folly of the ancients and the wisdom of the moderns. On certain days, and at certain times, the female number registered to him arrives with the pink coupon that allows him to have sexual relations. The only time that he is permitted for modesty's sake to lower the blinds of his glass room. And then, at the appointed time, he goes to sleep, a deep, dreamless sleep, to prepare for the unchanging and unchangeable round of the day that follows. There are no cares, no worries. All things are attended to by the benefactor, supreme leader of the 10 million people who, in the aftermath of the disastrous 200 years' war, preserved and perfected civilization. Surrounding it all is the green wall, a massive glass partition separating the orderly mathematical world of the numbers from nature, from the past, from chaos, and from the great scourge of mankind, liberty." In the private journal he keeps for himself, D503 can scarcely contain his rapturous enthusiasm for the orderly world in which he lives. The table of hours, he writes, turns each one of us into a figure of steel, a six-wheeled hero of a mighty epic poem, every morning with six-wheeled precision, at the same hour and the same moment. We, millions of us, get up as one. At the same hour, in million-headed unison, we start work, and in million-headed unison, we end it. The only break in this routine is 2 hours, from 16 to 17, and again from 21 to 22, that each number has time to his or herself. Such moments, D503 suggests, might contain within them the seeds of unhappiness. Sitting at his desk, he writes, quote, I am confident, and you may call me an idealist and a dreamer. I am confident that sooner or later, we shall fit these personal hours as well into the general formula. Someday, these 86,400 seconds will also be entered into the table of hours. D503 understands fully the wisdom of the benefactor and of the mathematically perfect one state. Beauty and truth, and above all happiness, are the consequences of unfreedom, as he calls it. Only when freedom is eliminated can there be genuine human happiness. The old legend told the story. Adam and Eve were given a choice, happiness without freedom or freedom without happiness. They chose freedom, and ever thereafter humans have longed for the chains. The one state had restored man to his pristine state of happiness. Paradise had been ensured, and the evil serpent of freedom vanquished. Everything is simple, heavenly, childish, simple. The benefactor, the machine, which reduces the enemies of the one state to puddles of chemically pure water. The cube, where the holy sacrament of execution is conducted. The glass bell, where the guilty deprived of air are forced to confess their crimes. The guardians, who watch our every move. All this is good, all this is sublime, magnificent, noble, elevated, crystally pure, because it protects our unfreedom, that is, our happiness. At first hearing, Zemyatin's words strike us as paradoxical. When Thomas Jefferson enumerated the fundamental rights of man, he famously presented them as a triad: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Zemyatin identified perhaps more clearly and presciently than any other writer the promise of totalitarianism to eliminate unhappiness by eliminating liberty. It is the fraught relationship between liberty and happiness that provides the motive force for Reed, certainly one of the most prophetic works produced in the 20th century. Yevgeny Zemyatin, the author, was born in 1884 in a small town south of Moscow. His father was an Orthodox priest and schoolmaster, his mother a teacher and musician. Like the protagonist of We, Zemyatin was an engineer, a naval architect. During his school years, he became a Bolshevik, and for a time was exiled from St. Petersburg for his activities. He spent the early years of World War I in England building ships. One of the things he built was the first icebreaker. He returned to Russia in time for the October Revolution of 1917. It did not take him long, though, to become disenchanted with the progress of the Communist Revolution. He had begun writing during his time in England, and after the revolution was part of the circle of Soviet writers led by Maxim Gorky. Zemyatin's artistic credo was simple. It was the job of the writer to be a heretic, to say no to official doctrine. This world, he wrote, is kept alive only by heretics. The heretic Christ, the heretic Copernicus, the heretic Tolstoy. Our symbol of faith is heresy. One aspect of the revolution which particularly annoyed Zemyatin was its tiresome monism, the press for absolute unanimity in all things. As he said in a 1921 essay, in the new era, the revolution would create a new cosmos, wherein there would be no more polyphony or dissonances. There shall only be majestic, monumental, and all-encompassing unanimity. Zemyatin had nothing but contempt for artists who bowed before the tyranny of the state. The revolution, he said in 1926, does not need dogs who sit up in expectation of a handout or because they fear the whip. Nor does it need trainers of such dogs. It needs writers who fear nothing. Zemyatin was just such a writer. In the years 1921 to 1922, he composed his greatest work, the science fiction novel We. There was no hope that it would ever get past the censors. It was smuggled out of Russia to England, where it was first published in English translation in 1924. The novel was intended as a satire, but it was a remarkably accurate description of the sort of society which would follow under the rule of Stalin. The author described it as both jesting and serious. Immediately, Zamyatin felt the sting of the Soviet whip, but this did not dissuade him. In 1927, the work was published in Russian in Czechoslovakia and then smuggled back into the Soviet Union. As knowledge of the book spread, Zamyatin was censured by the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers. The RAPP hounded artists, driving some to suicide. Zamyatin became the special focus of their activities and was ultimately banned from ever writing or publishing again. In 1931, with help from Maxim Gorky, he was able to flee Russia for the freer atmosphere of Paris. Now, while he lived in Paris, Zamyatin continued writing, but he never settled happily into the role of exile. He hoped to return to Russia, that a time would come, as he put in a letter to Stalin, that, quote, "it becomes possible in our country to serve great ideas without cringing before little men." But such hopes were in vain. Yevgeny Zamyatin died of a heart attack in Paris on March 10, 1937. He was barely 53 years old. Like many of the great Russian artistic figures of the 20th century, he was reduced by the Stalinist regime to non-being. His name was erased from literary histories and encyclopedias, and remained so until the fall of communism, hardly known inside his own country. Nevertheless, his work, in particular We, held a powerful influence over the imagination of Western writers. Among those who claimed to have been influenced by it were George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, Ayn Rand, and Kurt Vonnegut. In fact, Aldous Huxley said he stole the plot of Brave New World, which was then shamelessly stolen by Orwell for 1984. Like many of the great dystopian novels of the past century, We deals with totalitarianism. What is striking is how early the book is. Brave New World was published in 1932. 1984, published in 1948. Both Huxley and Orwell had the advantage of being able to look back on the historical development of totalitarian regimes in Soviet Russia, Italy, and in the case of Orwell, Nazi Germany. But Zamyatin was writing before the consolidation of the dictatorship in Russia. What he was describing was a vision of where he believed Russia to be headed. In that sense, and to the extent that Zamyatin correctly predicted the character of Stalinism, the work is prophetic rather than merely descriptive. What I would like to do for the remainder of my talk are consider elements of totalitarianism that Zamyatin describes, as well as consider his account of its origins, causes, but also of its flaws. To begin with, what is totalitarianism? One of my favorite accounts of the phenomenon appears in a lecture given by the Czech philosopher Ivan Svitak in Prague in March 1968. For those of you who know, this was at the beginning of the Prague Spring. Svitak mounted the lectern at the Charles University and gave an explication of what he saw as the nature of Soviet communism. According to Svitak, totalitarian dictatorships constitute a new form of absolutism, a modern type of despotism. The essence of totalitarian dictatorship is the reduction of the individual to a target for the power apparatus. Every totalitarian dictatorship must destroy personality and individuality, not because the leading politicians are sadists, although many are, but because the totalitarian orientation arises from the character of absolute, centralized, and unrestricted power. Propaganda and terror, the control of mass information media, the secret police are the most important instruments for the functionization of the individual. Terror, Svitak observed, is the foundation of totalitarianism. It is not a temporary expedient. Rather, quote, the basic function of terror consists in ensuring the functionalization of the citizen and in turning him into a pliable political tool of the power elite, end quote. Totalitarian movements arise from the internal weakness of democratic orders. The mass movements which give rise to totalitarianism are transformed into the bureaucratic machinery of government. At the beginning, they purport to represent the interest of the masses, but as power is consolidated, the state turns into an apparatus of repression, turned against those various classes which enthroned the new elite. Differences of opinion are regarded as heresy. Those holding them are regarded as enemies and traitors. Not only are the liberties of the individual and civil rights thrown overboard, this very suppression of freedom is extolled as the triumph of progress and the hallmark of a higher social order. Ultimately, Svitak concludes, totalitarian states have been and remain the biggest threat to humanity throughout its history. They constitute a total threat to human values, to culture, and to the meaning of human freedom. 4 decades before the Prague Spring, Semyotin had predicted many of the aspects of totalitarianism described by Spivak. The idea that the elimination of human freedom is a sign of progress is a central theme throughout Weed. At one point, D503 is reading a passage in the One State Gazette that admits that radical elements were attempting to undermine the one state and liberate the masses. D503 scoffs at the very word liberation. Amazing, he says. The extent to which criminal instincts persist in human nature. I use the word criminal deliberately. When man's freedom equals 0, he commits no crime. That is clear. The only means of ridding man of crime is ridding him of freedom. The bureaucratic regulation of all aspects of existence is another persistent theme, though here Semyotin's treatment is tinged with acerbic wit, especially when he tackles the matter of sex in the mathematically perfect one state. As he prepares for his weekly liaison with O90, his registered other, the narrator explains how, having conquered hunger, algebraically, by the sum of external welfare, the one state launched its attack on the other ruler of the world, love. And finally, this elemental force was also subjugated, organized, and reduced to mathematical order. Each number has a right to any other number, as to a sexual commodity. This is the lex sexualis. As our narrator explains, individuals were tested and then matched to scientific means and given coupons which could be redeemed for sex on one's assigned sexual days. The result of this ingenious system was the elimination of envy and jealousy. Quote, the denominator of the happiness fraction is reduced to 0, and the fraction is transformed into a magnificent infinity. And so, what to the ancients was a source of innumerable stupid tragedies has been reduced to a harmonious, pleasant, and useful function of the organism. A function like sleep, physical labor, the consumption of food, and defecation. In many ways, this passage gets to the heart of Semyotin's genius. The entire discussion is, on one level, a commentary on the relentless bureaucratization of the Soviet state and the attempts to regulate all aspects of human existence. At the same time, the passage is clearly a burlesque on Marx's sexual doctrine and his comments in the manifesto about the community of women. But there's something deeper than social commentary or satire at work. Hannah Arendt notes that one of the effects of the suppression of the individual in totalitarian societies is that it destroyed the very capacity for experience. Totalitarian movements, she says, conjure up a lying world of consistency, which is more adequate to the needs of the human mind than reality itself. It is within the framework of this false reality that the individual will is slowly crushed and obliterated. I can think of no better example of this conception than to reduce love to a physical function on par with defecation. There are actually a number of parallels between the future world of Semyotin's imagination and the historical reality of totalitarianism as described by Hannah Arendt. Here I'm going to dip up into 302 for a moment. The blind obedience of the numbers to the benefactor follows the pattern of total, unrestricted, unconditional, and unalterable loyalty demanded by Hitler and Stalin. The absolute dependence on the will and whims of the benefactor anticipates with eerie accuracy the cult of personality in Stalinist Russia, where one could follow the party line only if one repeated each morning what Stalin had announced the night before. Arendt described totalitarianism as, quote, a movement that is constantly kept in motion, namely the permanent domination of each individual in each and every sphere of life. The practical goal of the movement is to organize as many people as possible within its framework and to set and keep them in motion. In other words, the daily march to the steady rhythms of the music factory, the careful chewing of the metronome, the endless cycle of determined movements to the magisterial table of hours. D503 describes this mass concerted motion as a beautiful dance. But why is it beautiful? Why is dance beautiful, he asks? Answer, because it is unfree motion. Because the whole profound meaning of dance lies precisely in the absolute aesthetic subordination, an ideal unfreedom. There are two further aspects of totalitarianism discussed by Arendt that have immediate parallels in Zemyatin's future world. Arendt notes a paradox in totalitarianism. On the one hand, the application of terror atomizes people, undermining all human ties and leaving the individual naked and helpless before the power of the state. Simultaneously, through the elimination of barriers, the transparent walls described in the Doctor's Dream, people are pressed together, destroying the space between individuals. Both processes, the atomization and the pressing together, are part and parcel of a goal not only to revolutionize society, but to achieve the transformation of human nature itself. These processes, the atomization of society, combined with the elimination of individuality through the elimination of barriers, features prominently throughout Zemyatin's world. As for the transformation of human nature, I won't give away the ending, but when the one state turns to extreme measures to secure the happiness of its subjects, the narrator describes the effects as follows. People? No, that does not describe them. These are not feet. They are stiff, heavy wheels, moved by some invisible transmission belt. These are not people, they are humanoid tractors. Finally, Arendt describes the way in which totalitarian regimes build walls around the members to protect them from the outside world. The party divides the world in a binary manner, the regime and the hostile world beyond it. This binary account, she says, for the aggressiveness of the regime in action. Meanwhile, the regime attempts to wall off reality from its members, creating, as she calls it, a fool's paradise of normalcy. The same process appears at key moments in Zemyatin's work. D503 is diagnosed, at one point, with the worst possible sickness. He's developed a soul. His doctors have him take extended walks, which eventually lead him to the green wall itself. As he peers through the glass, he's terrified by what he sees. Quote, "From the illimitable green ocean behind the wall rose a wild wave of roots, flowers, branches, trees. It reared, and in a moment it would roll and break and overwhelm me. And instead of a man, the finest and most precise of instruments, I would be turned into, he stops. But fortunately, between me and the wild green ocean was the wall of glass. Oh, great, divinely bounding wisdom of walls and barriers. They are perhaps the greatest of man's inventions. Man ceased to be a wild animal only when he built the first wall. Man ceased to be a savage only when we built the green wall, when we had isolated our perfect mechanical world from the irrational, hideous world of trees, birds, animals. But there are cracks in the wall. No matter how complete the subjugation of will and intellect, problems remain. It is fitting that Zemyatin's protagonist first becomes aware of the problem when a school friend of his tells him of a number which seems utterly anarchic. The square root of -1. D503 responds to this revelation by banging his fists on the table, screaming, "I don't want the square root of -1. Take the square root of -1 out of me." Later, confronted by a personal crisis, he recognizes the truth. The square root of -1 is and remains a part of him. And that realization points toward the precariousness of human existence. All of us on earth, he says, walk constantly over a seething scarlet sea of flame, hidden below in the belly of the earth. We never think of it. But what if the thin crust under our feet should turn into glass, and we should suddenly see? It drops off there. What? What would we see? The fragility of the utopian world? The false reality placed before our eyes? The promise of the perfect world? Or is it that we see within ourselves the savage, untamable nature that mocks the mathematical precision of that perfect world? Human nature, it would seem, is the fly in the ointment that prevents totalitarianism from fully realizing its goals. And hence, it is human nature that is the thing totalitarian regimes, real ones as well as that of Zemyatin's prophetic imagination, must suppress, crush, and remake in its own image. Here I want to turn to the causes, at least as Zemyatin views them. Zemyatin has very little to say directly on the subject of how the one state came into being. In part, this is a function of the fact we are dependent on an unreliable narrator. But there are also some clues. Ostensibly, the one state, the triumph of all over one, of the sum over the individual, came as a consequence of the horrors of the 200 Years' War. We never hear of the origins of the war or of its results, except that only 0.2% of the world's population survived. Our narrator sheds no tears over this. The war, he says, cleansed the world of its millenarian filth and paved the way for the heights of bliss in the shining palace of the one state. Since then, no one had been outside the green wall, so far as he knows. The world beyond the wall contains something of the disorder, the irreason, the uncontrollable aspects that had dominated men's life before the war. One of the most powerful symbols of that disorder is a piano piece by Scriabin. The narrator hears it at a lecture that is given to demonstrate the folly of the ancients. He describes it as, quote, something savage, spasmodic, variegated, like the whole life at that time, not a trace of rational mechanical method. The audience responds appropriately. They laugh out loud at the song. Yet the scene reveals something significant. An assumption which runs through our narrator's thought is that society makes man in its own image. Moreover, it is imperative that society do so. Man in a corrupt society will be corrupted. One of the great champions of this view was the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. Bakunin rejected entirely the Enlightenment conception of the individual and of individual freedom. Man can only be free, he argued, within society. The entire social contract of Locke or Rousseau was pure nonsense from Bakunin's perspective. But so long as the old corrupt society existed, there could be no genuine freedom, so the state must be destroyed. But that was not all. Bakunin wished to destroy God as well. The Christian conception of the immortal soul was, for Bakunin, the source of egoism. It gave each individual person something godlike at their center. Man could never be free or happy so long as he believed in the ubiquity of his own soul. Semyatin constantly contrasts the old faith in God with the new faith in the one state. The former was a false god, an imperfect deity, the bored skeptic, as he calls him, who created imperfect man and filled him with all his imperfections. The one state destroyed that God and replaced it with something perfect. In the process, man was purged of the individual immortal soul. This is one of the points where I cannot help but wonder whether Semyatin was aware of Bakunin's views. Given his own position as a heretic among the Bolsheviks, it would seem more than likely that he might have borrowed an idea from an individual viewed by the Communist International as one of the most intransigent heretics in the history of Marxism. D503's periodic reflections on the imperfections of the ancients and his lack of perfection with or tolerance for the chaos of the old ways points to another underlying attraction of totalitarianism. Towards the end of his book on the prehistory of the Spanish Civil War, Gerald Brennan describes the membership of Falange, the Spanish fascist party. Its members were drawn from a wide range of groups across the social and political spectrum. But what all of them shared in common was frustration and disillusionment with the political system. What fascism promised was action and unanimity. In place of the tedious push and pull between right and left, there would be only one party, one viewpoint, and the struggle would finally be over. The greatest attraction of totalitarianism was the elimination of debate and its replacement with perfect unanimity. Unanimity, the elimination of dissent, the suppression of egoism. To this may be added the passion for equality. When an acquaintance of D503 takes him to a museum and then models for him a vivid yellow dress of an older time, keep in mind that all numbers wear identical gray uniforms, he responds by noting that she's trying to be original. She responds, clearly, to be original is to be in some way distinct from others. Hence, to be original is to violate equality. Reading those lines, I am always reminded of Tocqueville's description of the future American despotism from the end of democracy in America. Indulge me for a moment. I want to imagine with what new features despotism could be produced in the world. I see an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Each of them, withdrawn and apart, is like a stranger to the destiny of all the others. His children and his particular friends form the whole human species for him. As for dwelling with his fellow citizens, he is beside them, but he does not see them. He touches them and does not feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself alone, and if a family still remains for him, one can at least say that he no longer has a native country. Above these, an immense tutelary power is elevated, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had the object to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. After taking each individual by turns in its powerful hands and kneading him as it likes, the sovereign extends its arms over society as a whole, covers its surface with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules, through which the most original minds and most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not break wills, but it softens them, bends them, and directs them. It rarely forces one to act, but it constantly opposes itself to one's acting. It does not destroy, it prevents things from being born. It does not tyrannize. It hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. In many ways, Tocqueville's imagined despotism is precisely the society that Zemyatin creates in his novel. So, how can one resist such a fate? First of all, as Zemyatin said, we need heretics. I spent most of my career studying heresy, so go heretics. We need individuals who are willing to question the tyrannizing pieties that would, as Tocqueville says, hinder, compromise, enervate, extinguish, daze, and sheepify society at large. We need people to break down the Green Wall. When D503 comes face to face with the Green Wall, something remarkable happens to him. Through the glass, he writes, the blunt snout of some beast stared dully, mistily at me, yellow eyes, persistently repeating a single incomprehensible thought. For a long time, we stared into each other's eyes, those mind wells from the surface world into another subterranean one. And a question stirred within me. What if he, this yellow-eyed creature, in his disorderly, filthy mound of leaves, in his uncomputed life, is happier than me? What indeed? My mother used to say what ultimately destroyed Zion was World War II. It drew people away from their homes, not just young men, but young women who went to work in factories, by exposing them to the dangerous world outside of 33rd Street. They became less willing to accept unfreedom as the price of happiness. The millenarian, socialist, totalitarian utopia could only exist so long as its members had no conception of a world beyond their own numerically precise grid, and beyond the caricatures preached by the general overseer, their great benefactor. Paradoxically, one of the great tasks of the heretic, for Zemyatin, is to resist the predestinarian logic of the revolutionary cult. Napoleon is said to have remarked in the selfsame speech that he was the revolution and that the revolution was over. In other words, with the coming of his regime, the revolution had come to an end. There was no more need for revolution. History had, in effect, ended. The same predestinarian logic underlies most of Orthodox Marxism, as well as Orthodox, if we can use the term, fascism. Totalitarian regimes insist on the finality of their revolution. There can be nothing to succeed them, nothing to challenge them, nothing to improve upon. The totalitarian regime marks the eschaton, the perfection of man and the universe. As the most radical of Zemyatin's character asks, but how can there be a final revolution? There is no final one. Revolutions are infinite. Just as there is no final number in the sequence, there can be no final revolution. The promise of finality is the folly of totalitarianism, and simultaneously the cause of its tyranny, and the reason for its downfall. To close, the folly of Zion and the folly of the one state are the same. While the faithful Christian might recognize that there are beings who possess no imagination, no independent will, such beings are not humans, but angels. When God created man, he gave him an independent will. It is for that being that man is a little above the angels. What Zemyatin tells us, thinking also theologically, is that the preservation of that spark of divinity requires fleeing beyond the walls, leaving behind the perfect happiness of unfreedom for the dangerous, irrational, absurd, dangerous, and chaotic happiness of the yellow-eyed, shaggy beasts who enjoy their dirty pile of leaves in the imperfect and hence perfectly human happiness of liberty.